This chapter here, chapter 20, is the title is a potpourri of creativity, creating a melting pot that supports justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I was reading it again this morning, and I thought, I was trying to think of how to summarize this opening few paragraphs. I don't think I could do a better job than the words I used when I wrote it. So I'm just going to go ahead and read those, and then I'll get into some summary of the remaining portion of the chapter. I don't care about your persuasion. Put aside all politics. Do your best to embrace your biases, and maybe we can have a meaningful conversation about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I don't care if you're a Black American in a large urban area, a Christian conservative, a transgender gay Latina, a Caucasian liberal from the suburbs, or a female farmer who has never been outside of her state lines. Again, I come back to the statement that your truth or my truth is not the truth. It's only the truth from your experience and context. There is risk for me to present my perspective on Jedi and the importance of uncovering restraints of unconscious bias because I am a 50-year-old white male who has benefited from being part of the white male power structure his whole life. I have bias, as we all do. All of that being said, I'm going to give it a shot. Frequently, people are too intimidated to talk about bias out of fear of offending. This fear impedes our ability to have a healthy conversation and move in a healthier direction. The subject is near and dear to my heart, if for no other reason than the challenge it has presented in building Bigby. We have always been aware of our lack of diversity, and we suffer from the comfortable and complacent position of status quo. It has never been a make or break issue for us, and we always kick the can down the path as it fell into the important but not urgent category. But at last, we have taken on Jedi, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Though our progress has been agonizingly slow, but in this chapter, I want to talk about how I am so committed to improving Jedi at Bigby and the world over. And when I read that this morning, I was like, I wrote this like 2 years ago, and I've felt a whole bunch of progress in the last 2 years. It is super inspiring to me. What I wanted to do in that opening there really was just really try to talk about the fact that we've got to talk. We have to talk about our biases. We have to bring them to the front. The only way we learn is by exposing our biases. And the only way we expose our biases is when others point them out to us. If we aren't having the conversation about it, there won't be improvements. And so the conversation is the important part. The next section, I call it a birds of a feather flocking together, and I address the issue that like people like to be with like people, and it's just sort of this weird natural thing that happens for human beings, and that we have to work hard in the face of that, right? Like we have to be deliberate. We're not going to end up with a beautiful, diverse, multicultural environment if we don't try to do it. I guess my point is it doesn't happen by accident. I use an example in here, and it's the point of it is how a lack of diversity impedes our ability to have engaging, interesting conversations. If the majority of your team is, white male partnered to a heterosexual white person living in the suburbs, graduated from college in 4.5 years, and you save up each year to take 10-day vacation in Florida and spend your free time chasing your kids around to sporting events on weekends, how much diversity of thinking is going on in that group? We're social creatures, and we tend to hang out with people that are like us. But again, that impedes our ability to have diverse thinking. Bias covers a broad spectrum, and it's not just gender or race or sexual orientation. There's all kinds of biases in the world that get in our way, and we all have different kinds of biases. And there's a bias in relation to people with disabilities. There's a bias towards people that have a felony conviction. There's an age-related bias. There's transgender. The list goes on and on. I try to make a somewhat light example of bias, talking about how the average CEO in America is, obviously a white male who's 2.5 inches taller than the average. And so it's a bias against short, fat white dudes like me, and so trying to bring a little levity to it. But, that is, I mean, I do believe bias is at play. It's in something like that. And the point I'm making here, which I'm proud of, is that the end of the era of the fat, rich white guy is over, right? And it's changing, maybe not as quickly as we'd like it to, but it is changing. And the point, I want to see a world where people who are leading don't have the perspective of centuries of the white male power structure behind them. And what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that act like? And to me, that's a super exciting proposition. And let's give diverse teams a shot, right? I mean, the male white power structure has been in place for a very long time, and things aren't awesome, right? So like let's do it, right? I had an experience the year I wrote the book where the Kalamazoo College was had me slated to become a trustee. I think it was kind of figured that I was a bit of a shoe-in. Yeah, I went through all the proceedings. It's a whole formal process you have to go through, and then it goes to a board vote, and I got denied. And a leader within that organization called me, a friend of mine, and he said, Mike, I just want to let you know, like, there was no way in the world we were putting a 50-year-old rich white dude on the board at this point. And I've got more respect for the organization now than if they'd put me on the board, right? Look at the slate of people they did put on the board, and it was freaking awesome, right? So, I was proud of them. I called the president, Jorge, and I told him I was perfectly happy and comfortable with the decision, and that I would obviously continue to support the college proudly. I don't think that would have happened 15 or 20 years ago. I really don't. I think I would have just gotten shooed right onto that board, and away we would have gone. And I go on a rant about how we just need to have more female judges, and I've always believed that my whole life. Like, I think there shouldn't be another male judge elected for the next 30 years. Let's just turn it over, right? So, moving on, that was a little rant I went on in the book. I closed the chapter with diversity around the table is just the start. Next, you have to create an environment for people to be authentic and actually bring the viewpoints that might fly in the face of the traditional structure, the traditional mechanism. And we need to create that environment as teams, but it does start with leadership. And I think that the hard part about teams and having bias around teams is we don't know what we don't know. And I had a really dramatic event happen for me that really pointed this concept out to me. I was with a Muslim family. It was a franchise owner, and I walked up to the franchisee's daughter, and being gregarious and outgoing, I stuck my hand out, right? Like, hey, hi, it's nice to meet you. And she just turned, and her brother grabbed me by the arm, and he said, listen, she doesn't want to shake a man's hand. And so, like, I wasn't aware that there's a lot of Muslim cultures that you need to ask permission first, right? Before you push your hand out in the middle of somebody's face and act like it's normal. But it was normal for me, but I didn't know what I didn't know, right? And that's an amazing example for me of how cultural bias can get in our way. And so in closing, it's about bringing all of us together with all of our different biases. We're never going to get rid of bias, right? Bias is going to be around. Like, we will all have bias. I do a whole thing in an article I wrote about how, if you're a woman who immigrated to New York City from Korea, and you're 32 years old and you're a lesbian and you were raised by your mother who worked 2 jobs to put you through private school, like, you've got bias, right? Like, and you've got certain beliefs. And so to me, it's not about wiping the slate clean of bias. What it's about is putting people in a room and letting their biases collide, and then have smart people work through those biases so we can all learn from them. And to me, ultimately, that's the point at the end of the day, is we all need to be learning and growing from each other's biases. And we need other people to expose our biases if that makes sense. You can't expose your own bias sitting in a room by yourself. It just doesn't work. And I'm just going to read a paragraph here. What I hope is clear from this chapter is that I'm not arguing we should focus on getting rid of bias per se, but rather we should bring as many different biases together and make sure they all have an equal voice. Biases will collide, and smart people empathize, understand, analyze, and bring forth strong options that encompass each person's experience and viewpoint to bring the best solutions forward. And to me, that's the point.